All right, in this unit, we're turning to issues of human nature, enormously complex and a varied set of issues. And here are the questions that we're turning to involve getting a sense for our identities, what our core capacities are, what we can expect of ourselves, how we should fundamentally evaluate our identities. This is a set of issues that has a long history. As long as there has been philosophy and as long as there has been religion, there have been views about what makes a human being the kind of being that it is. And as the science has rather developed, in addition to philosophers having views on core issues in human nature and theologians having views as well, there's been an expansive literature developed by psychologists and biologists and anthropologists, all bearing on these same set of issues here. What I'm going to do in this unit is first lay out 5 issues out of the enormous complex of issues that can be raised about human nature, but 5 issues that philosophers have traditionally had something to say and that there have been controversies within the philosophical literature about. And also the same 5 issues that, in my judgment, have significance, great significance for educational practice. Now, when people turn their attention to issues of human nature and trying to understand ourselves, in most cases, their initial set is to see the human being as a microcosm of the macrocosm. So that is to say, what we think of the human being, right, in particular, is something that falls out of our general metaphysical approach. So, for example, if we have a more naturalistic metaphysics, that is to say, we see the universe as a natural system, as a self-governing, self-contained system, then we are more likely then to see the human being as part and parcel of the natural system, and we'll describe the human being in naturalistic terms. By contrast, if we have a religious metaphysics, that is to say, we tend to think of the universe metaphysically as divided into 2 spheres, a natural sphere and then a realm beyond the natural world, superior to a supernatural dimension. Then typically we will interpret the human being again as a microcosm, see part of our identity as being rooted in the natural order of things, but also another part of our nature, and perhaps the more significant part of our nature, as being derived from or rooted in the supernatural dimension. So that's the first issue that we've got on my list of 5 that I'm going to single out for our attention. Should we approach the study of human nature naturalistically, that is to say, see ourselves organically as part of the natural world, or do we need to understand the human being more in dualistic terms, that is to say our bodies are derived from the natural world, but our minds or our souls or our spirits are a different kind of thing altogether, and they have a non-natural metaphysical source, the supernatural dimension. Second key issue philosophers have debated and still debate that has important implications for education is if we focus on the psychological side of our nature, right, our minds or our souls or our spirits or our consciousness. I'm going to use those terms mostly interchangeably as far as this session goes. Clearly, 2 of the significant capacities for us as human beings is our rational capacity and our emotional capacity. We have the capacity for abstract thought, and that can be very sophisticated. And we also have a capacity for a very wide range of, in many cases, very intense and subtle emotions. So we have an emotional capacity and we have a rational capacity. What is the relationship between those 2? Is it the case that primarily reason is in charge and it dictates the content of our emotional states, or is it the case that our emotional lives are the things that are fundamentally in charge and have a life of their own, and that they dictate what goes on the reasoning side of our equation here? That then leads us directly to a third issue I've got on the board, talking about the relationship between the mind and the body, or more particularly the reason and the emotion. Do we characterize those relationships fundamentally as a harmonious relationship? That is to say that our minds should work with our bodies, our reason should work with our emotions, right, and vice versa. That they should be integrated, or they ultimately have the same agenda, the same approach, and so therefore should be on the same page? Or is it the case that our minds and our bodies, our reasons and our emotions, those capacities each have their own lives, their own agendas, and that in many or most cases those are in conflict with each other. And so to be a human being then is to be fundamentally a conflict management system or conflict-driven being, and any sort of ultimate harmony, putting things together in a package is not doable. Fourth issue to draw to our attention is an issue of control. How much control do human beings have over their thoughts, over their feelings, over their actions, and then thinking more broadly speaking, their destinies? Is it the case that human beings, while of course subject to various forces beyond their control, perhaps their genetic heritage or various things that happen to them in the environment, they nonetheless do have a volitional capacity. They can make choices over what they think, over what they do, choices for which they can then be held responsible? Or is it the case that we don't really have any sort of free choice or any control fundamentally, but rather all of our thoughts, all of our feelings, the actions and so forth are determined by causal forces beyond our immediate control? And there have been many versions of determinism historically. Some versions emphasize biological forces, arguing that biology ultimately is destiny, that we all have a certain genetic package, for example, that we are born. And as we grow and develop, our genetic package expresses itself in terms of our capacities, and all of our capacities then are primarily determined by genetic forces. Others will argue that we do have a biological package, obviously, that grows and develops, but when its biological imperative is taken as far as it goes, we're still left with a great deal of plasticity, and that therefore environmental forces, including social forces, have a great deal of power over manipulating, shaping, and forcing the human being into a particular being with a particular set of thoughts, a particular set of emotions, a particular set of behaviors. And so really the primary locus of control is in environmental and subset social forces. Another prominent version of determinism historically has been theological in orientation. Some versions of religion emphasize that the controlling power in the universe, including the controlling power over what human beings do, is God or the gods, and so largely then what happens here on earth and what happens in human affairs and what happens in my life in particular is a matter of being a plaything of the gods, right? Or that God has written the script and assigned me a role, and he is directing me and guiding me through, but really the script is more or less written, and I have no control over the outcome of the various plots and subplots, right, and so forth. The fifth issue, rather, to draw your attention to here has an evaluative dimension, and it's an issue of human nature, arguing in the sense that what we're talking about is what is given to human beings at birth, that is to say, beyond their control or before biology has reached its full destiny or before social or environmental forces have exerted their influence. What's the kind of the moral status of the core human nature, the core human potential that we are given? And here are the three options, broadly speaking, that have come down to us in the philosophical and the religious traditions, have been to say that at birth, that is to say, at the origin of the human nature, there's a fundamental badness or a fundamental sin that is part of the original package, and that the dominating fact of the human condition is dealing with, grappling with, or otherwise trying to manage this original badness that is built into us. And here the expectation is that human beings left to their own devices, the bad in them dominates, and left to their own devices, to the extent that human agency is active in the world, it is badness that is going to manifest itself in the world. The opposite view, much more optimistic view of human nature, has been to say that built into the human condition is an original goodness, that the natural, the normal, or the dominant mode of being, mode of behaving and acting is in the healthy direction, in a positive direction. Human beings are born with certain capacities. As those capacities come online or as they are trained, The normal and to be expected development is for them to develop in a positive direction, and to the extent that people become bad, that's an aberrant maldevelopment or a malfunction of something either in the system or in the training. But that means that we can expect of ourselves a positive development, that rather the primary project in our lives is to let our natural, healthy, and positive developments out and to nurture those rather than being in a position of being saddled with an original sin that we first have to deal with in order to get to ground zero, so to speak. Third position argues that neither of these is true, that human beings are not born weighted one way or the other, that instead, morally speaking, we're born with a set of capacities and there is no preset developmental route, whether those capacities are going to be developed in the positive or in the negative direction. Instead, it's entirely a matter of the choices that individuals make or the training and influences that they are exposed to. Those capacities are in themselves perfectly neutral, but they can be developed and trained in a positive or good sense, or they can be equally easily trained in a negative or harmful direction. All right, these are 5 issues of importance philosophically and also theologically. What I want to do for the remainder of this session is focus on this first issue here, which is largely a foundational issue for all of the other ones. And so I want to spend a certain amount of time focusing on this one. We'll fold in little bits of discussion here and there about the other issues, and then certainly we will return to all of these issues in later units in the course and fold in their significance to educational practice as that comes up. All right, next I want to turn to a core issue in human nature that's known as the mind-body issue, or since in many cases a very puzzling set of issues, the mind-body problem. We introduce this issue is if we look at the human being and we just start to describe the human being and its capacities and its properties kind of journalistically, certain things then jump out at us. Obviously, on the one hand, we can say the human being has a set of physical properties, and for physical, rather than having to write that out each time, I'm just going to use the Greek symbol phi to designate the physical. Human beings have a body. That body has a number of properties, has a mass, or if it's in a gravitational field, as we typically are, we have weight. It has color. It has certain chemical composition that we can describe. We can describe it in terms of textures. If we are close enough, we can smell, right, or various other things. Right? So there are various physical properties or physical states or physical attributes that the human being has. At the same time, we are not like just rocks and chairs and things that are purely physical and can be exhaustively described only in terms of these properties here. We are also beings that have a psychological life. And psychological is also a largish word, so I'm going to use Greek symbol psi as abbreviation for psyche, psychological, anything in that particular area. We also have, for example, various kinds of perceptual experiences. I can be aware of those things. I can have memories of. So even though my grandmother's apple pie is not before me right now, I can have a memory and a fairly strong psychological experience of what the smell and experience of eating grandma's apple pie was like. I can have various thoughts. I can be thinking about what my grandmother looked like. I can be thinking about quadratic equations. I can be thinking about the ontological argument. All of these are possible to me, and we can have rich and varied thoughts here. I can also, of course, have various kinds of emotions of joy, nervousness, anxiety, anger, pride, exaltation, and so forth, nostalgia, and so on. All right, so The human being then has physical properties and has psychological properties. The key question that we ask when we raise the mind-body issue is, what is the relationship between the psychological properties that we have and the physical properties? And so then ask, what is, in effect, the nature of this relationship? Now, I'm going to talk through three different answers to this question of what the relationship is. Throughout much of the history of philosophy, there has been a broadly three-way debate. Each of the major positions we will talk about have had many sub-variations, and there have been attempts to combine various ones or form compromise versions of the ones. But what I'm going to talk about are three centers of gravity, three broad approaches to answering this particular question that have currency still in psychological discussions, in biological discussions, philosophical discussions, and have had so historically. And also, again, three that have importance for education, because depending on which of those three approaches one adopts, one's approach to educational issues differs dramatically. All right. One possible answer to the question of the relationship between the physical and the psychological is to say that fundamentally there is no relation between the two, other than a happenstance relationship or any sort of external relationship between these two sides. That the best way to understand the nature of a human being is to say that what we have are two sets of properties, but they are properties that belong to two different substances or two different types of reality that happen to coexist in the human being temporarily as we know him or her. Now, this position goes by the name of dualism for obvious reasons. Is to say that what we should do is understand the physical and all of the related properties here as one kind of stuff, right, that the human being has as part of its identity, and that we should understand the psychological as, and all of its properties as being made up of a very different kind of stuff, a non-physical kind of stuff, perhaps soul stuff or spirit stuff or consciousness or mind. All of those things then understood as being non-physical states of being. So we would then say that what we have here is that the physical and the psychological are very different kinds of stuff. So we can understand then in this case the human being perhaps as being a microcosm of the metaphysical order of things, that are the physical side of our beings comes from the natural world, the natural world being physical, and the psychological side of our being comes from the supernatural world being comprised of spiritual phenomena. And so we have a spirit that is our mind and all of these traits here, and we have a body, and they happen to coexist for a certain amount of time. So the human being is, on this term here, or on this way of looking at things, an aggregate. Using the concept aggregate in the literal sense here of just two things that happen to be joined together, but even while they are joined and semi-mixed together, they still retain their independent identities as being the kinds of stuff that they are, and they in principle can be then separated from each other. So for example, if we were to take a jar and to pour into it a bunch of M&Ms and then to pour into it a bunch of small stones and shook it around, we would still have an aggregate. We'd have two things that are in the same jar, and they're sharing space together, and they are interacting with each other to some extent. But nonetheless, the stones and the M&Ms are retaining their distinct identities as the kinds of beings that they are. Now, also often packaged historically in this dualist account is an evaluative dimension, a judgment that if we are looking at the psychological and the physical sides here and deciding which of these is more important, which one is more significant, in which is the essence of what it is to be a human being properly found, the dualist will argue that it's the psychological side of our nature, not the physical side of our natures, that is the more significant here. So I'll put that point down. The psychological is the more significant, right, or essential part of human nature. And this is playing off the insight that we have that our psychological side is very important to who we are, what we think, what we feel, and all of the goals and dreams and aspirations and our conceptions of what our what a meaningful life is. All of this is stuff that goes on the psychological side of our nature. And it's also playing off on the notion that if we compare ourselves to the other species that exist in the world, they seem to be more straightforwardly physical being with lesser developed or less significant psychological lives. So the argument then can be that the physical side of our nature is what we share with the animals, is what we share with the physical world, and what then sets us apart as the distinctive kinds of beings that we are is the psychological. And so we should identify ourselves primarily with the psychological side of our nature, and therefore the correlate view being that the physical is the less significant or the less important, right, part of our identity here. Sometimes packaged with the dualist view is the notion that there's a conflict between these two, that the psychological and the physical being different kinds of things. They therefore have different needs, different aspirations, different goals. And so at any given time, the human being is tugged or pulled in different directions. The psychological side of us wants to go in this direction to realize its true nature and its identity. Meanwhile, the physical is also clamoring for attention. It wants to go off in this direction and achieve its destiny. But those two different directions mean that one has a conflict, and one has to make a choice then whether to go in the physical side or in the psychological side. All right, that's dualism, and is one of the main historical theories about human nature. It's probably the oldest, and if we just did things numerically, there have been more people historically who have signed on to some form of dualism over the course of human history than any other theory. But it has received a great deal of competition among scientific investigators, philosophical investigators who will give more naturalistic accounts of what it is to be the human being. And then particularly as we've gotten into the modern world, dualism has declined, although it's still a significant contender, and it's perhaps true to say that more naturalistic approaches to the human being, at least among scientific investigators, is the dominant approach here. One kind of opposition to dualism is to then turn again to this question of the relationship between the psychological and the physical, and to argue the exact opposite, to deny everything that dualism has said. And this position, I'll first leave space for an adjective here, then is a kind of materialism. I'm going to say that what the human being is part of the natural world. The natural world is a complicated physical system, so therefore the human being simply is a complicated physical system, right? It's a complicated arrangement of matter. We can take all of the chemicals and show how all of the various chemical compounds come into being. In the human being, there is just a whole series of chemical compounds with very impressive and complicated properties that have come into being as a result of those compounds. But if we're talking about the psychological is then not anything over and above or different than the material system that gives rise to it. Instead, what we will say is the reason why we as human beings have a complicated psychological life, that we can do all of these things here, is because we have a very complicated brain. We have a large brain, but the brain is a material system. It's made up ultimately of chemicals in various complicated patterns. And so what we call psychological phenomena are byproducts or offshoots of underlying physical products. And so the adjective that I want to put in here is the word reductive. And that is to say that we should understand the human being as a material system and only as a material system. That is to say, in terms of underlying physical properties, all of these things that we call psychological properties can be explained in terms of and reduced to a description in terms of underlying physical properties. So we don't ultimately, when we have it all worked out, the full account of what it is to be a human being, ever need to use any of these words anymore. Instead, a full description of a human being will simply be a very complicated description of various material systems in process here. So what we will then say here is the psychological is simply that might not be the best word there since it's not simple, but it is ultimately only a manifestation of or a byproduct of the underlying physical. And that is ultimately only physical properties are real. What we then can say about the psychological is that they are, and this is a moderately technical piece of terminology, the psychological properties are merely what we will call epiphenomena. The real phenomena are physical property, and the psychological are just epiphenomena, or just derivative phenomena that are just along for the ride but really aren't doing anything or contributing anything to the process. The third position I want to articulate now or mention that has been, again, historically a major contender and has many advocates in the modern world, 20th century, in psychology, philosophy, and related fields, is a position that I'm going to call Integrationism. And here, as the name suggests, that if we're going to give an account of the human being and the relationship between the psychological and the physical, what we should not do, as the dualists do, is separate the two and give independent accounts of each, nor should we, as the reductive materialists do, focus only on the physical and reduce the psychological rather entirely to the physical, but rather the proper understanding of the relationship is to see the psychological and the physical as two inextricably interconnected, two interdependent aspects of one harmoniously functioning or one integrated being. So we would describe this here as to say then that, as the name suggests, the physical and the psychological are two integrated aspects of one unified entity. So we can separate out, for purposes of analysis, memories. We can separate out emotions and focus on them just, again, for purposes of analysis. And we can also separate out and focus on simply the physical properties. But the human being as an actual functioning system never just is body, never just is psyche. Instead, everything that we are and everything that we do is an integrated functioning of the physical and the psychological. So if we say, for example, in the case of perceptions, we say, well, we can talk about the experience of seeing, right? I am seeing the camera right now, so I'm having a certain psychological experience right now, or you are seeing the board with color arrangements and various words, so you are having a certain psychological experience right now. That's a perception. There is necessarily an underlying physical bodily state. We have an eye. So then we could ask the question, what's the relationship between the experience of seeing and the organ of sight, right? What's the relationship between seeing and the eye? And it's not the case that we have two things that are going on here. Instead, the seeing is, right, the functioning of the eye, right, or the seeing and the eye being in a certain state are two aspects, two ways of describing one interconnected, one interrelated phenomenon. Also, the integrationists will argue against the reductive materialists that instead of everything that be going on psychologically being a manifestation of or a more or less useless byproduct of underlying physical properties, that the psychological has its causal powers that have come into existence, and so rather than all of the causation being a one-way street, so to speak, from physical things upward to psychological things from the perspective of the integrationists also have causal powers to influence physical things. So, for example, I can have thoughts that influence my body just as things that happen to my body can influence my thoughts. So if, for example, I were to climb through the camera here and smack you upside the head, right, that's something that would physically happen to you, but that would have various causation psychologically. You would get angry, you would be surprised, you would be shocked, you would start to plan revenge, and all of those psychological things then would be causally functional, or causally resulting, or causal effects from physical properties. But then at the same time, at a certain point you would decide to act on whatever thoughts that you had, and so you would then say, all right, I am now going to put this revenge plan in practice. I'm going to track that guy down and take my revenge on him. And so your thoughts then would cause your body to get up from the chair, and go to put the plan in action, whatever it was. So the psychological is caused to have certain states by the physical and vice versa. And so sometimes in integrationist approaches, there is the notion here of emergent causation. That is to say, as the physical systems of our bodies, including our brains, have developed and become more complicated, new causal powers have come into existence psychologically, and those ones then can in turn influence the development of underlying physical traits. All right, 3 abstract descriptions of 3 positions that are possible here, and 3 positions that have been historically dominant. To make this a little bit less abstract, I want to add some graphics that I find useful when I think about this set of issues here. And so for that I'm going to use red. The way I think of dualism is as follows. Here we have the physical. And to capture this more significance, more essential part of human nature, and then the less importance of the physical here, above the physical, I will put the psychological. So we have the physical and we have the psychological, but these are 2 different kinds of things, 2 different kinds of stuffs, each with its own nature, with its own goals, each with its own natures and destinies. So I'll put a solid line here to indicate a radical or hard distinction between the physical side of our nature, the lower side, and the higher psychological side of our nature. So use that as a graphic for dualism. For reductive materialism, the kind of graphic I think is useful is to think of ourselves as a body, right, as a physical system, and as dominantly, right, as a physical system. And so all of the explanations and focus that we give to ourselves as human beings is to focus on the physicality of our being. That's the only fundamental reality here. Now, it's true that these psychological things do exist. They're not simply illusions here. They are a part of the world, but they're not really doing very much. They are merely epiphenomena. They're just a useless byproduct, so to speak, of the underlying physical process. So I'll just put them up here. And they are just little emanations, right, that come out, but really all the action is here on the physical side. Now, as a graphic for the integrationist approach, if we have 2 equally important, necessarily interdependent aspects of one unified being, then the way I characterize this graphically is to say we are a physical being, but equally so, we are a psychological being, and the relationship between these 2 is interdependent. Physical things can cause psychological things, and then in turn, psychological properties can influence and cause physical states, and so the human being is seen as an integrated, interdependent being of this sort here. Another way to think about this is in terms of tags that sometimes are helpful here. So one way of thinking about dualism, for example, and don't put too much weight on these tags. They don't capture all of the versions of dualism or all of the versions of reductive materialism or integrationism, but they're useful aids to the memory, so to speak. One way of thinking about dualism is to think of ourselves, the human being is a ghost in a machine. Right, the idea here being that the machine part being our bodily nature, which can be understood totally in mechanical terms, separated from the soul. All it is a mechanical system. But our psychological side is a ghost, and a ghost is traditionally understood as a disembodied soul or a disembodied spirit that hasn't gone on to heaven or been reincarnated yet. And so it's a non-material entity, and in this case here, the human being simply is a body that's a mechanical system and a spirit that happen to be cohabiting for a certain amount of time. The way best to think of reductive materialism in terms of a tag here is to use the following analogy, to say something like the following, that, again, this is not original to me, but mind is to matter what smoke is to fire. If we think of fire, right, fire is a complicated physical system. You have some underlying physical products, wood, right, or whatever, that's undergoing a chemical transformation, right, that we call combustion, and all of the heat, all of the energy, all of the light is embodied there. But then we have this smoke that kind of is a byproduct here, but the smoke really doesn't do anything. It's not causing the fire. It's not shedding any light on the scenario. It's not generating any heat, really, so to speak. It's just along for the ride. It's a useless byproduct. And so the same thing holds then for the human being. What's going on is various complicated things in our material system. The mental or the psychological is like the smoke. It's a useless byproduct here. Verbal tag, I think, was useful for integrationism. Many integrationists are fond of modern developments in artificial intelligence, fond of making development or analogies to computing systems. And so, again, not necessarily putting a great deal of weight on this analogy here, but one that helps to capture the flavor of integrationism in contrast to the other two, is to say something like the following, that mind is to body what software is to hardware. The idea here being that if you're going to have a computing system that's functional, an actual functioning computer system with all of its capacities, doing the kinds of things that it's doing, it's not just hardware. Hardware left to its own devices is not going to do anything. It's not just software. Instead, it's an integration of software. Software being the actual running of a program on the physical system that is the computer hardware. And so you can't separate hardware from software and have any sort of functioning computing going on. Instead, what we call computing, right, having a living computing system, right, so to speak, is the actual running of software on an actual machine, and it's the integrated byproduct or byplay and interplay between the two of them, where the hardware is sending signals to the software, right, and vice versa, and that's what we call a computing system. All right, and then by analogy, the psychological, certainly if we think about thoughts, right, many of our thoughts are programs. We do addition. We've learned various routines for adding numbers or multiplying numbers. What we're doing is using our brains according to certain abstract instructional patterns, and it's what we call thinking, right, can then be thought of, at least analogically, in terms of the software that is our thinking running on our hardware, which is our brain. Next, I want to turn to some arguments for and against the three positions that we have articulated here, asking the question, why might one come to think that dualism is true? Why might one come to question dualism and think, therefore, that some sort of reductive materialism or integrationism is true? Again, it's a hugely complicated set of issues, and a huge literature on all of these issues has been developed. So I'm just going to single out four arguments or four considerations that have traditionally motivated dualism, some considerations that have traditionally motivated the other two approaches, the more naturalistic approaches, and then we'll turn to issues of the educational implications of one's subscription to either dualism or integrationism or reductive materialism. All right, so suppose we ask the question why we might come to think that dualism is true. That is to say, why might we think that the physical and the psychological are different kinds of stuff, different kinds of substances, that we can't explain the human being either in purely materialistic terms or purely spiritual terms. Well, one reason, of course, people historically have come to dualism is not that they have necessarily thought through that particular set of issues independently and looked at the arguments for and against, but rather that dualism comes packaged with a religious set of beliefs that they have had. So they might, for example, have been raised in a religious tradition, and dualism is simply part of that religious tradition. A religious tradition that says, for example, God exists, God is a purely spiritual being, he's completely other from the natural world, which is a purely physical part of reality, and then we come to know God through faith in certain traditions or faith in certain scriptures. And so part of the overall package of beliefs that the person absorbs is the idea that the human being then is partly soul, partly body, that when he or she dies, the body returns to dust, the soul separates from the body, and then goes on to its ultimate destiny, which might be to go to heaven or to go to hell, or in some versions of Eastern religions, to be reincarnated into another body. So one reason why people might come to dualism is simply that it is part of a religious package. Now, second reason is particularly thinking within the terms of that religious package. If one gets philosophical about it and thinks about the implications of dualism, one part of the package that's typically important to most religions is the issue of morality. And the question of, if we have a certain set of views that we think are moral, we want people to behave certain ways, what is going to motivate them to act morally and to avoid various kinds of immoral behaviors that we might think they are tempted to partake in? And dualism can be a part of a moral package, arguing that morality requires a certain kind of motivation, and that a naturalistic approach to understanding the human being isn't going to provide that. Naturalism, one of the implications of it is that there is no such thing as a soul that is separate from the body that survives bodily death, and so that if that's the case, when we die, the story is over for us. And then the question is, if that's all there is to life, why should we act morally according to traditional religious moralities here? So we might then argue that if we believe in dualism, and we get people to believe in dualism, people will then believe that their soul has a life that carries on past this bodily existence, past their existence in this physical world, and that the fate of their soul in the afterlife is contingent upon how they behave in the here and now. And so morality requires dualism, the idea here being as a motivator. People will act morally if they think they're going to heaven or hell, depends upon their acting morally. If they don't believe there is such a thing as a heaven or hell, if they don't believe that there's a soul that they have and that other people have, then morality from this perspective seems to be a non-starter. The third reason for dualism, when people think about it, is based on trying to explain psychological phenomena and apparent psychological phenomena that don't seem to be easily or obviously or even possibly susceptible of a naturalistic explanation. So there are all kinds of various what are called paranormal claims to certain sorts of experiences. People, for example, might claim to have various kinds of out-of-body experiences. In earlier times, when people would have dreams, it seems like when the body is largely inert, when one is sleeping, there's not a whole lot going on there. Nonetheless, one can have very complicated dream states involving many plots and subplots that don't necessarily hang together. But how do we explain all of that rich stuff that's going on psychologically when there's nothing going on apparently physically, or very minimal things going on physically here? So we might make the claim that dream states are things that can't be explained on purely physicalistic terms. Or people who have had, say, near-death experiences. They suffer some sort of trauma, perhaps in an automobile accident. They are rushed to the emergency room, hooked up to various kinds of life-preserving equipment, but everything goes flatline. The physicians are about to pronounce the person clinically dead after a certain amount of time has passed, but then, for whatever reason, the heart starts beating again, and the person is resuscitated. In many cases, people will independently make claims to have had certain psychological experiences during this process of feeling like they're separating from their body, that they're hovering above or near their bodies, or the experience of there being in a dark ascending tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel there is a white light or a bright light that they are being drawn to, and then suddenly they find themselves back in their body, so to speak. Or various claims to having psychic phenomena where we can read various people's minds and so forth. So we can just say there's a broad category of special experiences, and in each case we might come to the conclusion that there's no way to account for these real phenomena. We take them to be real phenomena in naturalistic terms, and so therefore some sort of dualism must be true. Fourth kind of consideration I want to give is the argument that if we look at psychological phenomena, again, even if we don't focus on unusual experiences, just ordinary psychological experiences that everybody can accept and everybody will grant exist, that there is no way to capture all of those in purely naturalistic terms or in physicalistic terms, and so therefore dualism purely as a scientific hypothesis or as a philosophical hypothesis grounded in a best explanation model for real phenomena is the right approach here. So for example, we might say if we take physical properties, it makes sense for us to say that they have, say, weight, right? Or they have color, right? Or they have, say, right, velocity. Right? I am moving at 1 mile an hour in an eastward direction as it happens here. Now I'm moving at 3 miles an hour in a westward direction. All right, so all of these various physical properties, and these are all of the things that are true and accurate descriptions of physical properties. If we then turn to the psychological properties, when we start to describe them, we can point out that none of these things, or none of the descriptors, or none of the ways that we would describe physical properties applies in any literal or real sense to a psychological property. You know, so if I'm thinking about something, it doesn't make any sense to ask how much does that thought weigh, right? Or if I'm thinking of the ontological argument, what is the mass of the ontological argument? Or if the ontological argument is in the moon's gravitational field, does it weigh more than if it's in Jupiter's gravitational field? It's a nonsensical question. Questions of weight don't apply, except perhaps metaphorically. We might say, wow, that's a really heavy thought, but again, that's not a literal description here. So it's not the case, using this as a negative symbol, that those thoughts have weight. It's also the case that they don't have color, right? If I am thinking of my shirt, supposing we allow black to be a color for this example here, my thought and my experience of the blackness of my shirt is not itself black. And it doesn't make any sense to say that this thought is multicolored or blue or green, right, or whatever. Again, metaphorically, we might say, you know, I'm feeling blue today if I'm feeling a little bit down, but that's not, again, a literal descriptor here. So there's no color. And it doesn't make any sense to say, that thought or that feeling, the Pythagorean theorem that I'm just deriving in my head is, moving southwest at 17 miles an hour. That's just ridiculous. And so these thoughts don't seem to have velocity, right, et cetera. So the initial then observation is to say that the properties that we will use to describe physical phenomena are not applicable to psychological phenomena, and then whatever kind of vocabulary we develop for describing psychological phenomena is not likely then to be the kind of vocabulary that's appropriate for describing physical phenomena. And then the inference will be, well, if we have two very different vocabularies for describing these phenomena, they must therefore be two very different types of phenomena. All right, now, that said, I want to turn to the other side of the debate here. Dualism has had many advocates, many believers, right, over the course of the centuries, and still does. What I want to then focus on is the arguments here that might be stronger, right, than various other ones here. I want to set aside number one. This is, I think, journalistically true as an explanation for why people will come to believe dualism, but it stands or falls depending on the metaphysics of the religious system that we're talking about. So this would then really mean we have to go back and talk about the metaphysical issues, including all the packages that would, or elements of the package that would be bundled into it. This is not a standalone argument here for dualism. It's merely a description of how some people do come to believe in dualism. The second issue about the nature of morality and its grounding, I want to save that. In a later unit in this course, we will turn to ethics questions and questions about where morality comes from. This does have an important backfeed loop, obviously, to this issue of human nature, but I want to deal with this later in the course. This one here has generated a very lively literature. There are lots of time and money and whole institutions devoted to investigating claims of various sorts of paranormal phenomena. I can't say that I'm impressed with very much of the results here, but that doesn't necessarily dismiss all of them. But I do have one interesting anecdote to share about the near-death phenomena. I remember at the end of a conference one evening, it was a medical ethics conference, I was sitting around with some practitioners, doctors and nurses, and we were having an argument about paranormal phenomena just like this. And the claim that they made, to me, I thought was a very interesting analogy here. And none of them denied the reality of the near-death experience, that people, they weren't just making this up, that they really were having this kind of phenomenon here. But the explanation that one of them put forth, they had talked about this independently, and so the others were nodding their heads, was to argue that the near-death phenomenon and the psychological experience that goes with the near-death phenomena is best understood in terms of the energy source, blood, being cut off to the brain. And so that experience of being in the dark tunnel, rising toward a white light, is the psychological experience of the blood supply being cut off to the brain when there's heart failure at the moment of death. The interesting analogy that was made was to one of the older analog television sets, where you have your analog television set plugged into the wall. The energy source in this case is electricity. It feeds the system, all of the inner workings going on in the television system, and then you have a very bright, colorful, animated set of images that are projected on the screen there. But what happens on those analog televisions when you unplug it from the wall or you hit the off switch is that suddenly all of the colors and animation goes away, the screen goes black, or it seems, except for a convergence of all of the light to a white light at the middle of the screen, which then slowly recedes off into the distance, and sometimes there can be a bit of a 3D effect there. So the analogy then that was being made is to say that this is something that is an unusual experience, but it's not something that lends support to dualism, because it can be given a purely naturalistic explanation in terms of what's happening physiologically in the brain, actually, as the physiology of the brain is shutting down. This argument here about the relationship between the physical and the psychological, again, a very controversial argument, one that has obviously some weight to it, so to speak, and many variations of this kind of argument are out there in the literature. But again, it's controversial, and people will make other kinds of analogies to say that in many cases you can have, right, one phenomenon, but you can describe it from two different perspectives, or you can describe the same perspective from a broader perspective or from a narrower perspective. And the fact that we have two different perspectives or two different vocabularies does not necessarily mean that we're talking about two different kinds of phenomena here. So for example, if I have a balloon that has been inflated, I can talk about the inflation of the balloon and the pressure from two different perspectives. I can take the balloon in my hands and I can hold it and I can compress it, and then I can describe the experience of pressure, how the balloon feels in terms of its pressure against my hand as I'm trying to squeeze it. And it's a perfectly legitimate description of pressure and an accurate description of pressure. But at the same time, we can talk about the balloon in terms of a microscopic analysis of what's going on in the balloon, or smaller than microscopic, what's going on in terms of the atoms and molecules of air inside of the balloon, and we can give a complete description of the pressure of the balloon in terms of molecular motion, and not make any reference at all to tactile psychological experiences and so on. So the point here is that we'll have two very different vocabularies, the description of the molecular motion and my psychological experience, a description of the feeling of the pressure of the balloon, but we don't have two different phenomena going on here. We have one phenomenon given two different kinds of descriptions. And so that is seen as an argument here. Now, be that as it may, there are still lots of issues worth thinking about and investigating here. Many of them are fascinating and fun. I want now to turn to a couple of arguments, actually a trio of arguments that have led people to set aside dualism, many people, and then start to articulate and defend purely naturalistic understandings of what it is to be a human being. Two of the arguments are quite ancient. As long as human beings have been debating theories of human nature, these two arguments have been around. The third one is a much more modern argument developed in the 19th century. First argument, I'll actually do a different numbering system here, use letters at this point, is to say that dualism has a certain problem, and that is the problem of dependence, as it's called. I'll just give you the assertion first. And the problem of dependence against dualism is to say that all psychological phenomena can be shown to depend on underlying physical phenomena. So there is no psychological phenomena that has a life of its own or an independent existence, a separable existence, as dualism in principle claims. So we can show, for example, that perceptual experiences depend on certain types of perceptual apparatus in the brain, memory phenomena, emotional phenomena, intellectual phenomena, and thought phenomena, and so on, all of which are psychological, can't exist but for the existence and proper functioning of underlying physical phenomena. So let me give you kind of a homey example here. Suppose you or I were to drink 3 beers in quick succession. What would happen to me is I would, at least now, I would very quickly be close to drunk. My body would stop functioning quite appropriately. I would lose my coordination. My speech would start to be slurred, and so on. So there will be all of those phenomena. I would get very tired, and you just have to put me to bed fairly quickly here. Now, that is simply a matter of taking beer, right, which is a chemical compound, and putting it into my body, which is another chemical compound. And so we have a mixture of chemicals that are going on. And we would expect that if you have non-standard chemicals introduced into another chemical system, you're going to get some non-standard physical behavior. So that part is perfectly understandable. But the problem here is for dualism. If dualism is true, then what we call my mind or my thoughts or my soul or my spirit or my consciousness, it's a different kind of thing. It's not a chemical phenomenon, and so it should not, for its proper functioning, to be dependent upon underlying chemical states. And that does not seem to be true to the phenomenon of drunkenness or getting tipsy, because what seems to happen when we get drunk is that not only does our body start to become dysfunctional, our minds start to become dysfunctional, our thoughts become dysfunctional, our emotions start to become dysfunctional, and so forth. So we think we're incredibly intelligent, we think we're very witty, we think we are very attractive to members of the opposite sex, and so forth, but in fact our minds are just not functioning appropriately. And the question is, why is this happening, right? How is it then that we are losing our minds, right, so to speak, simply because of physical phenomena? In that case, the proper functioning of the psychological depends upon the proper functioning of the underlying physical in this particular case. And we can also do this through pathology. Physicians and other researchers who will study people who have suffered various sorts of traumas and have had various kinds of brain damage. They will lose a certain emotional capacity, or they will lose their long-term memories, or they'll lose the ability to make certain kinds of perceptual discriminations or think certain categories of thoughts. And in most cases, what we can then do is find damage to various parts of the brain that has occurred as a result of the trauma, and so therefore that psychological capacity is either impaired or just lost outright. And it seems that if dualism is true, the psychological should be remaining intact, right? Because the claim of dualism is that it is radically independent of the underlying physical phenomena. So the problem of dependence has been a traditional problem for dualism, and that has then led many investigators to believe that the psychological is a manifestation of, or in some tighter way, part of a natural phenomenon, part of an organic, natural human being. A related variation of this problem, but I'm going to separate it out, is traditionally called the problem of interaction. And it's another kind of independence issue here. And the claim made in this case here is that on dualistic grounds, the way dualists, at least strong forms of dualism, understand the theory and present the theory, interaction cannot be explained. Right? That dualism as a theory simply can't explain some of the most important phenomena that we are supposed to be explaining here. Now, the idea of interaction here is that it does seem to be the case that physical phenomena, things that happen to my body, interact with the psychological and cause certain psychological things to occur. So if you tell me, for example, various happy news, then I think certain happy thoughts, I have certain happy experiences emotionally, right, and so forth. But as certain sound waves then that were propagating, impinging upon my physical ear, all of that physical stuff caused certain psychological states to occur. And the interaction also goes the other way. I can have certain thoughts, which are just thoughts, purely hypothetical or purely theoretical, but then at a certain point I make a decision to act on the basis of those, and those thoughts then interact with my body and cause my body to do certain sorts of things. So the problem of interaction is that in the first place, what happens is that the physical does have certain causal influence on the psychological, and the psychological does have certain causal influence on the physical. So these interactions do go on in both directions here. Can dualism adequately explain this phenomenon here if the physical and the psychological are two different types of things? All right, so here's a homey example. I weigh 190 pounds, and right now I'm thinking that in about 5 seconds I'm going to jump up into the air. Now, that's just a hypothetical thought. Just thinking I should jump up in the air, and so now I'm going to jump up in the air. So there, I jump up into the air. Now here's the question. Clearly I had a thought, and the thought caused me to jump up in the air, but on dualistic grounds, how is that possible? How is it the case that if my thought, whatever's going on in my spirit, right, or in my mind, if that's a non-physical phenomenon, how can that cause 190 pounds, which is a substantial amount of stuff, to elevate itself off the ground? And it seems, at least on hardcore dualist accounts, to be an impossible phenomenon. Another example, a fictional example from Hollywood movies. If you think about ghost movies, there's a phenomenon that happens in almost all ghost movies. I'm not a big fan of ghost movies. Maybe that's because the 5 or 6 that I've seen have all been B or C grade horror or ghost type movies, and they all seem to have the same kind of plot. So here's the stereotypical plot of the ghost movie. Boy and girl, teenagers, they're in love with each other, dating each other, and so there's some sort of spooky phenomena that is happening in their town. They decide that they're going to investigate it. So a lot of this stuff seems to be centered on this spooky house on the outskirts of town. So they show up there at midnight and they're going to investigate, right, whatever the spooky phenomenon is. And of course they show up at the front door, and it's a dark and stormy night. They say things to each other like, "I thought you were going to bring the flashlights." Neither of them came prepared. So then they go into the house. They decide they're going to investigate. So everything is scary and creaky. And then they say, "Let's split up," right? And the boy says, "I will check the downstairs." And the girl says, "I will check the upstairs." So they split up. The girl, then we follow her up the creaky stairs, down the creaky hall. She opens the door to the bedroom where the murder was thought to have occurred, and the door creaks, and then she goes into the bedroom and then back toward the other end of the room. She sees the ghost sees her, their eyes meet, the girl screams, she turns around and runs out the door, and she slams the door behind her. Now then, she goes tearing off down the hall, the camera cuts to the ghost, and we see the ghost And this is perfectly appropriate on dualistic grounds, just sails right through the door and continues to chase the girl down the hallway. And that's appropriate. The ghost is, as dualism describes it, a non-physical phenomenon, so it can't interact or be interacted with by physical phenomenon, so the door is in no way an obstacle to it. And so the girl runs down the stairs, and as I remember, she tore through the dining room, she slammed that door, the ghost sailed right through it. She tore into the kitchen, slammed that door, the ghost has her caught in the kitchen. There's nowhere for her to run, so she starts throwing things at it. She throws a breadboard, a colander, knives, right, and so forth. And of course, all of these things just go through the ghost's body, right, so to speak, and all of that is perfectly appropriate on dualistic grounds, since the physical stuff can't interact with the dualistic stuff. So finally, the ghost gets the girl trapped in the corner, and the ghost reaches down with his hand and picks up the knife and stabs her to death. And that's cheating, right, in that particular ghost movie, because ghosts don't really have hands, and even if they did have ghostly hands, whatever those would be, the hand is a spiritual phenomenon, and it shouldn't be capable then of picking up a heavy phenomenon, physical phenomenon like a knife, let alone stabbing it into a physical body of the girl. So that's the problem. If dualism is true, as classically explained, how can we explain one of the core phenomena that we're supposed to be explaining if we're developing an account of human nature, and that is that the intimate interplay between the psychological and the physical is omnipresent in our lives. All right, third issue. Issue C, as I will call it here. This is the modern one. In many cases, the naturalists who were dissatisfied with dualist theories in the early modern world or in the ancient world would recognize these as problems for dualism, but they were not often very convincing in developing naturalistic alternatives. It wasn't until the development in the 19th century of evolutionary theory, most famously associated with Charles Darwin, published in his work, Origin of Species, in 1859. Darwin had actually worked it out a couple of decades earlier, but he was a more shy, timid kind of person and knew that the theory would evoke a firestorm. He did not want to subject himself to that. So it wasn't until the 1850s when someone else independently came across the same idea, a man named Alfred Wallace, that Darwin decided he should publish his work. And of course, a firestorm did ensue as a result of that. And the reason that the firestorm erupted is important issues obviously are at stake here. And then for the first time, the scientific community has developed a plausible account for, in purely naturalistic terms, all of the significant and substantial properties of the human being on evolutionary grounds. And so if evolutionary theory is true, then the human being, with all of its magnificent psychological properties, is part and parcel of the natural world, and ultimately we will be explaining the power of our psychological thoughts and emotions and so forth, in terms of the fact that we have a larger brain that either just is those thoughts in action, or that larger brain supports certain emergent properties, emergent psychological causal powers that we call thoughts and emotions that then themselves can act on the physical world in their own right. Evolutionary theory then is, I think, for all of the modern naturalistic approaches that I am aware of, the foundation for their approaches, whether they are integrationist or whether they are reductive materialist. And so that's the positive basis for their theory. These two problems, A and B, are their primary criticisms, rather, of the dualistic approach. And then certainly in turn, the dualists are highly critical of evolutionary theory and need to attack it whenever possible. And then we're into the standard debates between the more creationist model of human origins and the evolutionary model that's a big part of our intellectual life now in the 21st century. And certainly that's an issue that has important implications for what we teach in the classroom. In connection with evolutionary theory and its importance to modern naturalistic understandings of human nature, I'm reminded of an article I read once studying baboons and puzzling over the fact that while baboons are quite intelligent and are a formidable predator and can develop some fairly sophisticated social interactions, including hunting activities, they are vastly outstripped by chimpanzees, for example, which are also a highly intelligent ape. and capable of very sophisticated hunting activities, including complicated strategies and divisions of labor. One of the researchers had noticed that the chimpanzees, for example, will, if deciding to hunt a particular animal, have the following kind of strategy, which is similar to a strategy that many humans will use, and that is that they will have a teamwork that involves running the animal that's their prey animal into exhaustion. And so what they will do is stage chimpanzees in pairs at various stages along a fairly extended route, and then they'll assign a couple of chimpanzees to go and scare the herd animal, the animal that they want to capture. Usually it's a herd animal, cut it out of the herd, and then cause it to run away. And then the chimpanzees, say it's two of them who are assigned to do this initial, they will start chasing after it. But of course, at a certain point, they become exhausted and can no longer run, and the animal then can still run. But there's already stationed a couple of other chimpanzees who will take over the chase at that particular point. They will continue to chase the animal, which is starting to get tired, or now at a certain point, those chimpanzees will become exhausted, but then a third pair of chimpanzees will take over the chase. And then they will run the animal into the ground until it's finally exhausted, and then there will be another group of chimpanzees waiting to finish the animal off. Now, this researcher had noticed that by contrast, baboons seemed to be trying to do the same sort of thing. They had a strategy that involved the division of labor. And they would assign, say, a pair of baboons to go and initially startle and chase an animal, and the plan would start off perfectly, just fine. But then after a certain amount of time, 30 seconds or so, the baboons would just lose it, and they would just all start fighting amongst each other. And so, for example, the two baboons that were doing the initial chase on the animal would just be all running along, and it would seem like, from the researcher's perspective, that they would just suddenly forget what they were doing and why they were doing it, and they'd be looking around. And then the one baboon, anthropomorphizing a little bit here, would look over at the other baboon and remember that guy stole some nuts from him that morning, and so he's really ticked off at that guy, and will reach over and smack it. And then, of course, the other baboon is suddenly startled, realize he's been smacked, and so they then just start fighting with each other, and the herd animal that was supposed to be their lunch scampers off to safety. So the baboons don't seem to be able to generate and sustain large-scale strategies for hunting on the same scale that chimpanzees can do. So then they will go ahead and they will do the study of the anatomy of baboon brains and monkey brains, and then they will find out that in the appropriate parts in the cortex, the baboons have a certain amount of development there. The chimpanzees have more development there. And the argument then is that the reason why the chimpanzees can do more complicated thought and strategy is tied directly to their brain development. And so, by analogy, we consider our own selves, we can do more sophisticated strategy and thinking than chimpanzees can do. And the evolutionary argument is that we have evolved and developed a larger set of capacities in the cortex. And so our enhanced psychological capacities relative to the chimpanzee is directly a function of those underlying physical properties, just as with the chimpanzees, their enlarged psychological capacities are a function of their enlarged brain capacity relative to the baboon, and so on all the way down to lesser psychologically developed beings. And I want to turn to the educational implications, or some of the important educational implications for these broad theories of human nature. Obviously, there's a huge set of literature and a huge set of very fascinating and complicated issues that philosophers, theologians, biologists, psychologists, and so forth have to explore and have to continue to explore. But as educational practitioners, when we approach our educational practice deciding what we're going to teach, whom we're teaching, how we're going to teach, these theoretical approaches to human nature have a profound implication for different practices in the classroom. And so what I want to do in this next unit is single out four issues in which, as a result of direct application, a different theoretical approach to human nature is going to lead to dramatically different approaches in the classroom. First issue is, suppose we take a stereotypical example of a problem child. The stereotypical example that I'll pick on is a 7-year-old boy who is very active, very physical, and the teacher has had chronic problems with him throughout the school year, or at least early in the school year. I suppose she doesn't let it develop for too long, with his staying in his seat, working on the problems and issues that he's supposed to be working on, not fidgeting, not letting his mind wander, not trying to get things started by smacking the person who's sitting in front of him, right, and so on. So we've got a standard kid in second grade, say. All right. How do we, as a teacher, deal with this situation? Let me just indicate how, depending on which theoretical approach one has a preset toward, one is likely to deal with the situation very differently. Suppose we do it in a top-down fashion. We say, all right, suppose we take reductive materialism. I put the label up here in the graphic that we developed earlier on the board here as a guiding example. But suppose we put ourselves in the framework of the reductive materialist way of thinking about human nature. We are now a teacher and we're dealing with this 7-year-old boy. Well, as reductive materialists, we're then likely to say that the problem here, the problem the child has, is a physical problem. The behavioral problems and all of the psychological things are then going to be a manifestation of an underlying physical issue. We might say, well, you know, it's a 7-year-old boy, it's not a 7-year-old girl, and maybe there are big physiological differences that are going on between 7-year-old boys who are more prone to these kinds of things than 7-year-old girls. But essentially, it is a physical difference. Chances are good it's a chemical difference. So sort of reductive materials, we might assign a label to it. He has ADHD, he has, say, a chemical imbalance or a chemical surge or some sort of biochemical thing that is going on that is making it impossible for him to sit still, stay on task, and behave in the appropriate kinds of ways. Now, if that's our diagnosis of the solution, of the problem rather, then our solution is fairly simply going to fall out of this. If it's a biochemical problem, then we should solve the problem through biochemical means. And so what we will do is prescribe him with certain sorts of pills that will alter his biochemical makeup, and then presto, right, the problem goes away. But the point just is that we are approaching this particular educational problem from the perspective of a theory of human nature, diagnosing it as reductive materialists would do. It's a material problem, and so we engage in a material solution in this particular case. Now, by contrast, suppose we are dualists. We're a teacher, 7-year-old boy, acting up in class, right, not staying on task, right, and so forth. How are we likely to diagnose the problem in this situation? Well, we would likely say things like the following. Well, clearly the problem here is that the boy's body is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. He's fidgeting, he's hitting, he's speaking up, his eyes are wandering all over the place. So his body is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, but at the same time, as a 7-year-old boy, he knows what he's supposed to be doing. He knows, because he's been told repeatedly, that he's supposed to be sitting in that chair. He knows how to sit in the chair. He knows what it means to concentrate on the task at hand. So he knows what he's supposed to be doing, but his body is not doing what his body should be doing. And so the problem here is that he is not controlling himself. He is given various instructions from the teacher. He is disobeying those instructions. And so it's not primarily a physical problem, it's a psychological problem. This boy has not chosen to concentrate, to stay focused, to do what he has been ordered to do by the teachers. And so it's a moral problem. The child is being disobedient psychologically here, and so we have to deal with it in terms of a psychological disobedience or a moral disobedience, and perhaps some form of punishment, right, is appropriate to give the guy the proper motivation to have his psychological side, his mind control his body in the appropriate kind of fashion. So again, the idea here is exact same problem as we were dealing with earlier, but a very different diagnosis, very different approach to the problem. Is it a chemical issue that we deal with chemically, or is it a moral disobedience issue and we deal with it psychologically and morally? All right, suppose by contrast we are integrationists and we're dealing again with this 7-year-old boy. He's not staying on task in class. So physically, right, he's not engaged with and doing the appropriate kinds of behaviors. Why is his body then disengaged from the tasks at hand? Chances are we would then say, well, it must be also because psychologically he is disengaged from the task at hand. If we want his body to be on task, then we also have to have his mind on task. If we want his body focused, we have to get his mind focused. How do we get people focused so that physically and psychologically they are in the zone and focused on the things that they're supposed to be doing. Well, according to the integrationist approach, motivation is going to be a huge part of it here, and so our diagnosis might be that our our body is not motivated or moving in the right direction because our psychology, the 7-year-old boy, is not motivated in the right direction. He's bored, he's not interested. Why he should be doing that question has not been answered to his satisfaction. If we're integrationists, we're less likely to go with the reductionist solution and say, well, we just need to give him a pill so that he can stay on task. We might notice, for example, that the same 7-year-old boy, if you put him in front of a video game and give him the controller, he has absolutely no problem staying on task. It's not the case that he has a chemical imbalance in his brain. If he's interested in something, he will focus on it. He will play the video game and do all of the appropriate kinds of moves and solve the problems and move on to the next level and be enjoying it for an hour, for 2 hours, until his mom says you have to stop and come to dinner right now. So it's not a chemical problem. It's not that the kid is a bad kid. It's that the kid is not motivated. Maybe I am a boring teacher. Maybe I just haven't set up the issue and motivated it in a way that connects to the student's values. And so if I want to get the kids physically and psychologically engaged with this material, perhaps what I need to do is spend more time properly motivating and setting the context for the problem so that the child is then psychologically engaged, and then as a result of that, he will become physically engaged. So, do we moralize the issue? Do we see it as an issue of motivational psychology? Do we see it as an issue of physical imbalance? Now, we might say all of these things can occur on different situations. Sometimes it is a moral problem. Sometimes it is a chemical imbalance. Sometimes it is a motivational issue. The question is going to be, what's our general approach to these? What's our bias going to be, or our set? Which kinds of diagnoses are we first going to try and work through before we say, all right, that's not working, we move on to the other one? Dualism, reductive materialism, and integrationism lead teachers when they're dealing with their students to deal with those kinds of classroom management problems very differently and enact typically very different strategies. All right, another issue of educational implication that falls out of these theories of human nature and is of direct educational strategy importance is the issue of the extent to which cognition and action are integrated in our pedagogy, in the way we choose curricular elements, in the way we teach them, in the way we assign activities for students to be engaging in. And painting, again, very broad strokes, if we start from it in a top-down kind of fashion, dualism is going to emphasize, in most cases, the importance of cognition, but it will separate out cognitive issues from action issues. And that falls out of its theory here. Cognition is, from the dualist perspective, something that goes on psychologically. Action is something that is existential and physical. And as the dualist theory says, we should be separating those two out. Those are two separate spheres of action that don't necessarily need to be integrated with each other. And also, on the dualist account, it's the psychological that is more important. And so cognitive issues are assigned much more weight in dualist curricula than action issues. And so what you will then find typically is a very theory-oriented, very abstract-oriented curriculum without much effort being made to develop practical applications and existential behaviors that will model and put that into place. In the case of reductive materialism as a broad approach, you find the exact opposite. From the reductive materialist approach, it is the physical, it is the behavioral, it is the existential that has priority. Things that have to do with the psychological, with the abstract, with the theoretical, typically are dismissed as of being of much less importance. And so what you will find greatly emphasized in reductive materialist or more materialistically oriented curricula is a distrust or a distaste or a disinterest in abstract theory, and much more of an emphasis on learning by doing. And the learning that is going on is a doing kind of learning, that it's a matter of what works physically, existentially, behaviorally, and whether there is a nice correlation and a well worked out abstract theory that the student has as part and parcel of that. That is at best a secondary concern. What we're then more likely to find in the case of integrationism is that issues of cognition on the psychological side and issues of action or issues of application, issues of practice are given equal weight. equal importance, and the theoretical and the practical then are integrated. The abstract and the particular, right, are integrated, and there's typically less in the curriculum, less in the methodology that involves simply behavioral things for their own sake rather, and abstract things for their own sake. Instead, we might learn by doing, but we're putting an important weight on the doing and integrating that with a learned understanding of the abstract theoretical material. So practice is a guide to theory and is also equally guided by theory in an independent kind of way. All right, so that's a second way where one's abstract theory can lead one to very different educational emphases. The issue of whether cognition is tightly linked to action and practice, or whether one or the other is emphasized at the expense rather of the other. A third way in which abstract theory about human nature has important implications for educational practice concerns a curricular element. And that is the place of physical education in the curriculum. Right? Whether phys ed should be in the curriculum at all is sometimes controversial. If it is in the curriculum, is it kind of the first thing to be cut if budgets are cut, or do we assign physical education great importance? In many cases, that is an issue that can be driven by background assumptions about human nature. So let me give you an example. Again, suppose we approach this in a top-down fashion. Suppose I am a dualist. I am then more likely to say, well, physical education is focused on the body, so that's down here, but we do not, as dualists, assign very much weight to the body at all. And so in very strongly dualist curricula, our education should be focused on the important thing, the essentially human thing, and that is the psychological side of our nature. And so we should have a curriculum that focuses significantly or exclusively on the psychological and doesn't include physical education at all. An example, a couple of years ago, I was at a luncheon here at Rockford College, and it involved some alumni. I was sitting with a couple of women who had graduated from Rockford College in the 1940s, and one of the women told me about her very first job that she got after graduating from Rockford College, and that was at a teacher, and she had been hired at a school to be the physical education teacher at the school. And what was remarkable from her perspective was that she was the very first physical education teacher at this school, and the reason she was brought in to be the physical education teacher was that she was not of the religious persuasion of the school. The school had been a very traditional religious school, a convent school, and all of the teachers were nuns. And for as long as that school had been in existence, the judgment had been made that physical education is not properly part of the curriculum. Physical education is about the body, but proper education is about the soul, it's about the spirit, it's about the mind, and so physical education was not on the curriculum until during the experience of World War II. Apparently the convent school decided to modernize to some extent, and that it was appropriate to have physical education be part of the curriculum. But all the teachers were nuns, and it was felt to be inappropriate and inconsistent with their calling as nuns to have the nuns teach physical education. The nuns are supposed to be as distant as possible from physical things, and so that is why they felt while they had to teach physical education, they had to hire someone whom they regarded as an outsider to come in and teach the physical education. All right, so that's one more extreme example of dualism applied in a more extreme curricular situation where the judgment would be that physical education is not to be included in the curriculum at all, or if it is, it's as an afterthought and to be relegated to a position of lesser importance on the curriculum. Okay, now by contrast, suppose we approach the issue of physical education from the perspective of reductive materialism. Well, as a theoretical point, we're going to say the human being is a physical system. And so the health of the physical system is not just an issue in education, it is the issue in education. And so all of education really is physical education, and so physical education is the number one curricular element. And so everything should be physical education, right, in one form or another. But the argument then is going to be that if we put physical education at the foundation of our curriculum and we attend to the health of the body, we develop strong bodies, we develop flexible bodies, we develop bodies that have good nutrition, endurance, and all of the various other attributes of trait. By attending to those things and developing the body in the appropriate kind of way, everything else follows from that in a secondary fashion. So if we have a healthy body, then to the extent that we are interested in healthy psychological states, they will follow as a matter of course by attending first and foremost and primarily to the body. All right, suppose we are integrationists and we ask the same kind of question here. Should we include physical education? The integrationists will say yes. And physical education is going to be important, and the argument is going to be from their perspective that the physical development and the psychological development are of equal importance, and so some physical component should be developed throughout the curriculum. Right? That falls out of the more general point. Anything that's theoretical and abstract should also be taught in terms of its physical embodiment, its practical existential embodiment as well. And then if we turn to physical education as it's more traditionally conceived, having gym periods where students are learning various kinds of physical activities, sports, games, and so on. Partly that's a matter of developing the healthy body, but the idea here will be that all of those physical activities will be integrated with psychological activities. So if we're learning how to develop healthy bodies, folded into that physical education curriculum will be lessons about nutrition, about lifelong health, about properly taking care of your body and having a healthy psychology and a healthy attitude about exercise and enjoying sports, and including all of its psychological elements as well. Or if, for example, we are teaching the students how to play a sport, say the sport is, I don't know, tennis as an example here. We're interested in teaching the students tennis so that they do get their exercise. There's endurance elements there. There are flexibility elements there. We're interested in their learning the endurance issues, the rules of the game, so they know how to hold the racket, move their bodies, where to stand, and so forth. We want them to develop the proficiency at being able to do all of the various kinds of strokes. But at the same time, tennis as a sport is not simply a physical activity. There are lots of psychological issues about in the case of if you're playing doubles, teamwork, being a good loser, being a good winner, when you're behind, being able to suck it up and persevere and try to come back, not to give up, not to cry and whine, not to blame your racket, right, and so forth. So there are all of the psychological issues. There might even be aesthetic issues about sports that one would fold in, moral issues, as we've mentioned, about teamwork and leadership that would be folded in as well. So your physical education curriculum would not simply be a physicalistic exercise, just send them out on a nice day so they can get some exercise. That is important, but that is going to be integrated tightly with all of the psychological issues as well. So whether then physical education is not in the curriculum at all, or if it is barely on the curriculum, whether physical education dominates the curriculum almost exclusively, or whether physical education is integrated into the curriculum fairly substantially and all of the physical education things are taught tightly along with the psychological issues as well. Those kinds of curricular decisions and pedagogical issues about physical education will be given very different weight, very different emphasis, again, depending on what one's background theory about human nature is. One more issue of education implication of general theories of human nature. Suppose we put forth the perennially controversial issue of sex education. So should we teach sex education? If we do include sex education in the curriculum, how do we teach it? What is the content of our sex education here? Now here I want to back up a little bit and set the stage because the issues of sex and sex's connection to love is a very fascinating set of issues in the study of human nature and human ethics and human biology. But I want to show how on that very general issue of the relationship between sex and love, or the importance of sex and love, the dualists, the reductive materialists, and the integrationists have very different views on sex, love, and their connections. And as a result of that, when they turn to educational issues, become teachers, they have very different views about whether sex education should be included, and if so, how. All right, suppose we think in terms of dualism. How are we going to think about sex, love, right, and the relationship between the two of them? Well, a standard dualist account is to say, well, sex is obviously right on the physical side of the divide here. Sex is physical. There are physiological things that go on. It's a joining of two physical bodies, and there are chemical results and biochemical results that happen as a result of that. Love, by contrast, is an emotional state. Obviously, it involves our thinking to some extent. It involves our emotions to some extent. And it can have certain sort of physical manifestations as well. But a pure dualist account will say that love is a psychological phenomenon, and at best it's a spiritual phenomenon. But if we are dualists, then we are likely to then say, well, the psychological and the physical are distinct and ultimately unrelated things, and so love and sex are distinct and should be ultimately unrelated things. If we add to that an evaluative component, the physical from a dualistic perspective is lower, it's more animalistic. That then is more likely to lead to us to have certain attitudes towards sex. We'll see sex as low as animalistic, in more extreme cases as something that is shameful, something that we should not be engaging in. It's a kind of sin in most cases. By contrast, love, since it's a psychological phenomenon, it's a spiritual phenomenon, it's a higher phenomenon. It's a distinctively human thing, and so that is something that we should cultivate, something that we should cherish, something that we should strive for. So, from that perspective, dualistically, the ideal kind of person is going to be someone who has his or her physical appetites under control and does not engage with them, if it's at the lower animalistic side of their nature, but on the other hand is a very loving kind of person. The best kind of human relationships then are going to be relationships that are connections of spirits, a communion of souls, right, or admiring the other person for who that person is psychologically, and there won't be any sort of a physical connection between those two. The person will remain pure, right, as opposed to mixing impure sexual behavior in with love. Now, in the history of Western civilization, rightly or wrongly, that is given the label of Platonic love, Plato being one of the great dualist philosophers in the history of philosophy here. And at least as his reputation stands, Plato is an advocate of the best and highest form of love being a love that is a marriage of souls, and there is no sort of physical connection between the two. We see this in explicitly religious traditions. The best kind of person is someone who has taken a vow of celibacy or a vow of chastity, that is to say, to totally eliminate the physical and sexual side of their life and to focus on love as a spiritual connection, love for other people, love for God, or whomever the appropriate object of love should be. All right, so if we then assign this the label, right, Platonic, right, love, that puts us in a position to contrast, right, the dualist approach, right, with the various other approaches here. Suppose we think of love and sex as reductive materialists. How are we likely to approach this subject here? Well, again, we are likely to say, well, sex is clearly a physical phenomenon. Our sexual apparatus, or our physical organs, they undergo various processes. There's a whole hormonal story that can be told here. There's the whole biophysiology of sex that goes on in this case here. It's the means through which animals, including humans, reproduce themselves. It's a biochemical union, right, that occurs there. And what about love? Well, love is the psychological side of the equation. And certainly when we are sexually aroused, we find someone else who is very sexually attractive to us, we might have feelings like we are deeply in love with this person, that we want to spend the rest of our life with this person, and so on. But from the reductive materialist perspective, the love really is not an important phenomenon. It's a temporary phenomenon. It's a byproduct of just underlying hormonal, physiological phenomena. If we really want to understand what's going on, the reason why the person thinks that he or she is in love is that they are in a certain sexually charged state, and as long as that sexually charged state exists, they're going to feel like they're in love, but the love isn't real phenomena. It's not what's actually driving the ship. It's not the case that you love the person and therefore find them sexually attractive. It's rather there's a sexual attraction, and as a byproduct you feel the love state. And so, of course, if you ever find yourself no longer sexually attracted to the person, then the love goes away, and it's game over for that particular kind of relationship. Okay, so love is simply a hormonal state, or can be explained and reduced to an underlying physical state along those lines there. Now, then, as reductive materialists, what are we going to think in terms of the value of sex or the value of love? Well, sex is, from this perspective, going to be a good thing. It's a normal thing, right? It's a healthy thing. It's the way that human beings reproduce themselves, just as other animal species do. So if we're going to continue on the species, sex has to occur. And certainly by the time people are teenagers and they go through the puberty process, they're coming online sexually. Sexual behavior is what we should expect them to be engaging in. Any sort of not engaging in lots of sexual activity when you are sexually primed to go is abnormal behavior, and so as reductive materialists we would not be engaged in that. So from a reductive materialist perspective, and one value consequence of this is people who in a top-down fashion come to think that reductive materialism is true might then come to the conclusion to say, well, therefore the goal is to maximize my sexual activity as possible, and to minimize any sort of love connection here. Love might be a dangerous phenomenon. It leads people to make all kinds of commitments, get married, get saddled with children, right, and so forth. And so the best kind of life might be, if you think of this stereotypical swinging bachelor here, to have as much sex as possible with as many women as possible, but not ever to, in effect, let any woman get her hooks into him, so he gets tied down to the same old thing on a fairly regular basis. So we might say, from this perspective, the practice of many people of promiscuity, right, the notches on the bedpost approach to sexual morality is the ideal, and that has a natural fit with a reductive materialist approach. Because what you're doing, if you are promiscuous, is maximizing the physicality of sex, as much quantity there as possible, and minimizing at any sort of psychological, emotional, intellectual, or long-term commitment, kind of commitment that would be associated with it. All right, suppose now we turn to integrationism and say, all right, how would the integrationists be more likely then to approach the whole issue of sex, the whole issue of love? Well, the theory says in abstract form that the physical and psychological are equally important and codependent and interactive. If we then say that the sex is the physical side of the relationship, love is the psychological side of the relationship. It's certainly possible for people to have loving relationships without a sexual component. It's possible for them to have sexual relationships without a loving component. But from this perspective, the best kind of interaction is going to be an integrated kind of interaction, where you're having sex with someone whom you love, and the person whom you are in love with, you also find that person sexually attractive. So here we have the standard romantic ideal, which is to find someone with whom you have a deep psychological bond. You like their character, you like their personality, you like their goals, their values, their belief system, and to have a long-term romantic relationship with that person that involves having an erotically charged and mutually satisfying sex life as well. So what is going on in a romantic context is that when there's a meeting, right, of two bodies in a bedroom, that is an enjoyable and mutually satisfying relationship for the two individuals sexually or physically rather, but also it is a psychological union. It's a meeting of two minds, two souls, and people are bonding with each other emotionally and in terms of their character as well as physically. So romantic love and sex then is the ideal in this circumstance. So in terms of these labels, which we expect we're all familiar with here, in this case what we have is no sex, right, all love, right, as the ideal. Minimizing the physicality, maximizing the spirituality. In the case of promiscuity, we have the direct opposite. We have all sex, no love. Maximizing the physicality, minimizing the psychological side of it. And in the case of romantic sex, what we have is sex and love integrated as the name suggests. Okay, that said, suppose we now are educators and we are turning to curricular matters and we want to then make a judgment call. In the curriculum, do we include sex education? And if we do include sex education, what kind of sex education do we include? As we might expect, if we are dualists, then the implication is going to be that sex education is not something that we are inclined to be favorably committed to in the curriculum. We see sex as physical. We, in many respects, see that as beneath our dignity. Education should be focused differently. And so we should not have a sex education on the curriculum just because sex is not important enough on the value scale educationally that we should spend time on it. If, however, as dualists, we do say that sex education perhaps should be included in the curriculum given the nature of human behavior, and we know what teenagers are likely to be experiencing and feeling and wanting to be doing by the time they go through puberty. We can include sex education in the curriculum, but as dualists, it's going to be a very particular approach. What we will be emphasizing is a certain sexual morality that causes the students to realize that they should not be engaging in sexual behavior if they possibly can help it, that they should be remaining chaste, that they should be just saying no, that they should be practicing abstinence, and that if they are going to engage in sexual behavior, then at least on one traditional model, it should only happen by the time they get married in the context of a marriage relationship and for the purpose of procreation. And so we'll teach that particular approach to sex education if we decide to include sex education in the curriculum at all. Now, by contrast, if we're reductive materialists, sex education is almost undisputably going to be a part of the curriculum and a significant part of the curriculum. They're going to argue that's perfectly natural, it's perfectly normal for human beings to come online sexually as they go through puberty. And so we should, in the curriculum, teach them about all of the physical changes that are going to happen to their body so they're not surprised by them, and so they know how to deal with all of the hormonal surges and the weird things that they are feeling and the new things that they want to do with each other. And so all of that is what normal animals and healthy animals do, and so part of the education should be preparing them for being able to do so. We should also teach them the mechanics of sex, so it's not a complete mystery to them. So we know that the males have this apparatus, the females have this apparatus, this is how they fit together, this is what happens. We should also teach them there are physical consequences to sexual behavior. Pregnancy is a possibility, and if that happens, this is what's going to occur. There are sexually transmitted diseases, and that can be a consequence of sexual activity, and these are the physical consequences of those if they occur. If pregnancy is not a desired option at this stage in one's life, if getting sexually transmitted disease is not an attractive option, which it probably never is, then there are certain physical things that one can engage in order to prevent pregnancy and to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. And so perhaps part of the sex education will involve handing out condoms, teaching students how to use condoms, and so forth. And so the whole physical side of the phenomenon should be an important part of our education here. And we're not going to get all moralistically negative about sexual behavior because we're going to think as reductive materialists, well, it's perfectly natural. That's what every animal species does after it goes through its version of puberty. It has lots and lots of sex while they are young and vigorous, and they bring the next generation into the world. So that's just normal biological life. All right, suppose now we turn to integrationism, and we again raise the same sort of a question here. Do we have sex education, and if so, do we teach it this way or that way, or what is the way that we're going to teach it here? Here I think the answer is fairly clear, that from the integrationist perspective, one's love life, one's sex life is going to be an important part of one's life as a human being. If it's complicated, then it should be part of the curriculum, and so most integrationists will argue that all of the physical changes, all the psychological things that go on as students approach puberty and go through puberty are a legitimate part of the educational process. And they will also agree with the reductive materialists that it's normal, it's natural, it's healthy for people to be having sexual feelings, sexual thoughts, and all of the romantic and loving thoughts that can go along with that sort of thing. And so that also then should be a part of the curriculum as well. And so students should learn about the mechanics. They should learn about pregnancy issues. They should learn about sexually transmitted diseases and how to prevent getting those things if at all possible. But for the integrationists, the sex education curriculum is likely to be more complicated, because from their perspective, sex is not purely a physicalistic activity. It's also a psychologically rich activity as well, and involves thoughts, character, emotions, values, issues of long-term commitments, and so on. And so while dealing with the very complicated sexual issues, we know that teenagers are also dealing with the complicated feelings, the complicated thoughts. How do I know whether I really love this person? What's the difference between infatuation and love? Or if I'm thinking about having sex with someone, how do I know that that person actually loves me, say, as opposed to just wanting me for my body? What kind of person should I be attracted to? If I'm thinking about long-term commitments, what kind of a person might I be thinking about possibly marrying down the road? What kind of physical attributes, what kind of character attributes, what kind of values and so forth are important to me in my life, such that I want to have another person involved in this life with me in not only a psychologically intimate way, but also a sexually intimate way. So the psychology of love and sex, as well as the physicality of love and sex, and the very tight interconnections between all of those, will be an important part of the integrationist curriculum as well. So we might have the health education class be teaching the sex mechanics issues, and perhaps in the English class we'll be reading literature that involves people falling in love with each other, and all of those explorations about who is the right person for the person to fall in love with, and under what circumstances they decide to consummate the relationship sexually, right, or not. Or if we think, I don't know if this is an exercise that you went through personally, but it certainly is a common exercise for teenagers the world over, that when they start becoming attracted to other people and start to think in terms of long-term relationships and going steady and having sexual relationships and possibly getting married and so forth, in many cases what those kids start doing is they start writing lists of what their ideal partner would look like. And in many cases on those lists, what's on there are certain physical traits that they want: this color hair, this kind of eyes, this height, right, this body shape, and so on. But also equally important and integrated into that list will be character traits. You know, they want the person to be intelligent, to be honest, to be sensitive, right, and so forth. And they spend a lot of time trying to imagine the ideal integrated package, right, as personified in another person. That's their goal. And so part of our job as educators, when we know that students will be working through this very complicated and important part of their lives, with the appropriate discretion, give them the right kind of tools educationally so that they can do so successfully and hopefully reaching a happy resolution.